So get this, podcast listeners. Florida Democrats on a school board leave the Democrat Party after being censured for standing up against CRT and anti-white racism. So let me say that again. There are a bunch of Florida Democrats, I think there are several of them. They're on a school board. And on that school board, there was all these equity statements and so forth in Palm Beach County, Florida. And the Democrats on the school board had such pushback that they decided to reverse their decisions. And then the Democrat Party in that county said to them, including a congressional candidate, said to them, you know what? If you guys don't implement CRT and this anti-white curriculum, then we're going to censure you. So they were censured and they said, fine, we're just going to change party affiliation, in which case they did.
Good.
So they left the Democrat Party. And so this brings up this whole issue of CRT across the country. And podcast listeners, I know you've heard us talk about this before in other podcasts and so forth. But what's interesting is we always try to bring in China on this issue as well, because Maoist China really did the same thing. And I'm going to talk to these two delegates about this issue about CRT, because it's like going full flavor here in Maryland across the various school boards and school systems. But in Maoist China, there were these things called struggle sessions. And struggle sessions were a form of public humiliation and torture used by the Chinese Communist Party at various times during the Mao era, particularly during the years immediately before and after establishment of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and during the Cultural Revolution. The aim of these struggle sessions was to shape public opinion, as well as to humiliate, persecute, or execute political rivals and those deemed class enemies. So hear me out on this. In general, the victim of a struggle session was forced to admit various crimes before a crowd of people the crowd would then verbally and physically abuse the victim until the victim confessed during the struggle sessions that they were wrong, that they owned too much property, that they were too successful, that they were criminals against the state. And that, of course, is all about class struggles and classicism, which, of course, is Marxism. The difference is that in modern America, they're using CRT to use race to get to Marxism instead of classicism. But some of it's classicist too, because if you actually read these documents, you'll see. So before we go to the delegates, we want to play in Loudoun County, Virginia, where they are all in on critical race theory. There is a survivor of Mao's China, who's now an American citizen, who provided testimony at the Loudoun County Board. I think it was either the Board of Supervisors or it was the school board, probably the school board. And good for her. We have a clip on that. It's a minute long, so it's a little long, but it's worth listening to because this is from someone who's been there, done that. We have that clip, and here it is.
I've been very alarmed about what's going on in our school. You are now training our children to be social justice warriors and to loathe our country and our history. Growing up in Mao's China, all this seemed very familiar. The communist regime used the same critical theory to divide people. The only difference is they use class instead of race. During the Cultural Revolution, I witnessed students and teachers turn against each other. We changed school names to be politically correct. We were taught to denounce our heritage. The Red Guards destroy anything that is not communist, old statues, books, and anything else. We are also encouraged to report on each other, just like the Student Equity Ambassador Program and the bias reporting system. This is indeed the American version of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The critical race theory has its roots in cultural Marxism. It should have no place in our schools.
So there you go. I mean, you can't get better than that. That is someone who lived through Mao's China and is actually talking about how there are identical things happening now in the public school system. And of course, what better time to get people to indoctrinate them than when they're in K to 12, right? With all of this stuff. Thoughts on this, Brian?
It's eerie. It really is. It's eerie to hear that because it does mirror what we're seeing in society today. And one of the things I took out of the clip that I didn't pick up before was neighbor turning in neighbor. And we just saw that. We just went through 9 months of that. Neighbors turning their neighbor for being outside or having a party or not having a mask on. And what are those that do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And we have far too many people now that are buying into this this whole idea.
Because they haven't learned history.
You should be ashamed of who you are rather than being.
Because we're changing history. We're knocking down statues because we don't want you to learn about those statues. We don't want those to be teaching moments about bad things that happen in history. So therefore, you don't even know that they happen. We don't want to teach history. We want to teach only history about equity, which is equality of outcome.
And I think we did start with class, and now we've moved on to race because they found the class wasn't working as well, because we did have so many people that were starting to prosper that they weren't buying into the whole class division thing. And they said, no, it's not class anymore. It's your color, because it's easy to divide people up. And when they divide them up, and then we end up with Mao killed 45 million people. That is a staggering number.
Actually, in the 20th century, 100 million people were murdered in the name of Marxism. And that was between, of course, the Soviet Union and, of course, Maoist China. 100 million people. And what's remarkable is how uneducated the average American is. And I say this sadly, not because I'm happy, sadly, that they don't see these similarities. And it takes someone from Maoist China to get in front of the Loudoun County, Virginia School Board to talk to the elected officials who are blinded by what's happening in front of them. And in fact, they support it. What do you think about that, Matt?
I think it's crazy right now, what's going on. It should be really scary and should be eye-opening to people. When we were talking about the camps there where people were being publicly shamed, the first thing that popped in my mind was the BLM protests, walking around like Washington, D.C., those open-air restaurants, telling people to publicly shame under threat of violence to get on your knees and swear solidarity with them.
Yes.
And it's just completely through intimidation. And this is so concerning from what our kids are learning to what's going on in our own government and our own military and what's just being taught. CRT is anti-white, anti-American, and pro-Marxist.
It is. It's also anti-religion. In addition to that, part of CRT, in my opinion, and part of the whole Maoist idea and the communist idea occurred during the pandemic, whereby governments, including our own government in Maryland, decided to make decisions as to who was essential and who wasn't. Now, you tell me this. At some future crisis in our country, whatever the crisis is, I'm not talking even about a pandemic. I'm talking about some crisis, a crisis where we don't have enough food because there was some sort of EMT attack against our power grid. Do people who are essential, are they the ones who get the food?
You know what? I don't even know if it needs to be set up in that dramatic of a situation. I mean, they floated ideas as like, well, we've locked down for COVID. Could we lock down to solve climate change?
Yes, good point.
I mean,
good point.
And you're sitting here like, well, they couldn't do that. The heck they couldn't.
And they could also say, Matt, that, hey, look, since we already went down this road of who's essential and who's not, we already identified those people. If you're essential, you can continue life as normal. You can be John Kerry and get on a private jet. But if you're not essential, oh no, sorry, stay at home, stay indoors, put your mask on, shut up.
Shut your business down and starve.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're telling you.
Was this a practice run?
Right. Well,
and
you
failed.
always see this in normally third world countries. And now the ideology is at our doorstep. This is what Reagan warned us about. And it's very, very concerning. Very concerning.
What did he say? Freedom's only one generation
away from.
And you hit on it earlier when we were talking about the kids, and that's why they start there, because once they've got the educational system, they got the culture. And going back to culture, it's hard to change somebody's mind because that's the formative years. So we get them from 1st through 12th grade. And sadly, going back to your point earlier, we're the ones paying for it, the ones that are totally against this, but we're paying for it through taxpayer or tax dollars for my kid to be indoctrinated.
And that's why we're talking about this in this podcast. This whole theme through this podcast is, how do we affect the change that we want when we know that it is correct, namely school choice, as well as stopping this defunding the police nonsense. And namely, it's defund the government.
Well,
it's telling people to withhold their tax payments. So until we get the change that we need, because the people that are keeping, in my opinion, and I've said it before, and it's totally politically incorrect, the people that are keeping the black community on the plantation are the liberals. Well, the same people that owned the plantations before.
Teaching children to hate themselves, to hate their country, it's divisive, and it's not worth a single dime of taxpayer money to put behind it. And really, it starts with some leadership, right? I mean, three of us, we talk pretty regularly about this kind of stuff, but it starts with your political party. And I'm kind of wondering where some of the Republican leadership is.
Well, it's selfish. It's honestly, it's selfish because it's all about elevating themselves, but doing it in a way because they're afraid to take on the fire or the fight.
Where is the Republican leadership? Why don't I hit that? Go hit that, Brian. I want to hear it.
I have no idea.
Well, I mean,
You asked the question. Where are they?
I don't know. I mean, they'll sit there and argue about like little things. Like locally in my county, we just had this big argument across a whole board of county commissioners, Republican county commissioners, on whether they should fund the football fields and replacement with AstroTurf versus increasing teacher salaries for schools that are closed. And I'm like, well, what about some of the curriculum choices our kids are making?
Is there a third option?
Do you want to address that? So is it, again, it's a Republican Party that's really lacking some leadership.
Because at the local level, let's face it, okay, and this is not going to be also politically correct. At the local level, for the most part, people who are elected at local government level, they are some of the most important elected officials because they control budgets and they control budgets of schools and school systems, but they also tend to be the least informed elected officials as well.
They try not to be political, and what really eats them up are the political people at that point.
Yes, they eat them alive.
Yeah, they just
Absolutely.
eat them alive, and it can't turn. But looking back on it, the person that understood this the best was President Trump. As far as pushing back and understanding the cultural significance of some of these programs and some of these challenges.
And I think that's the popularity of Governor DeSantis now, because Governor DeSantis has the backbone and the wherewithal to say, this is horrible for us, and I'm going to stand up and fight. And now you have people from across the country now gravitating to him and his message, because there's a lot of people out there like us, even though they try to tell us there's not, that gravitate towards this, that want to hear the message that your opinion matters, your thought matters. We're not going to let some overarching government educate your kids and tell you who can succeed.
Defund the government. Defund the government. That's the answer, right?
It needs to be defunded because, I mean, there's just a huge problem with this. And one thing you'll notice about it is the last 10 years, I say, maybe since the George Bush administration, every election seems to be the most important election. Have you noticed that?
Oh, yeah, of course.
This is the most important election of our lifetime. Well, why? It shouldn't be, right? I mean,
it's true.
If you're following the Constitution, the government may be able to implement smaller ideas, but every election shouldn't be.
Well, that goes also with all the spending, because clearly that's probably
let's take
one
the
of the
power
biggest
away
threats.
from the government, and you know what? We'll call it freedom. How about that?
That's true.